The brothers WISP. The brothers WISP, brothers WISP. The brothers WISP. The brothers.
You're now listening to Greg.
Hey everybody, this is Tommy. I goofed up the show and just wanted to throw in a quick apology. The video is totally goofed up and I apologize for that. Audio should totally be fine. And I just wanted to also throw in our quick shout outs. I spaced out doing those at the beginning because we were tight on time for doing the cast. So real quick, the Brothers WISP is brought to you by our sponsors. First off is Sonar, a scalable, intuitive, and comprehensive ISP billing and operational support system. Learn more at Sonar.Software. TowerCoverage.com. Tower Coverage is your RF propagation system to empower your network. Real-time data metrics enable your coverage area, reaching your customer base and more. The industry's best RF propagation mapping system allows website integration for customer sign-up and pre-qualification. Use this data to scientifically plan network expansion and help your WISP succeed. Get a free trial today at towercoverage.com. Preseam is an edge network QoE solution that enables proactive management of the network and subscriber experience to achieve higher customer satisfaction while lowering operational costs and increasing revenue. Preseam is made by Aterlo Networks, whose goal is to enable local and regional ISPs to thrive by solving network problems with products that people love. Launched in 2017, Preseam has helped more than 400 ISPs in the US and around the world deliver better internet to their subscribers. And finally, Villo, a complete mesh Wi-Fi hardware and remote management solution that empowers WISPs of any size to delight your customers. Reduce your operating costs and grow your business. Designed with input and feedback from the ISP community, Villo is proud to be a trusted partner of over 150 ISPs around the world. Preseam also asked that I mention that they are going to be having a event at WISPapalooza. Check last podcast because I did not. Oh, here it is. They'll be having a Preseam 101 and networking event. Details are Palace Room 3 at Paris, Las Vegas on Monday, October 3rd from 2 to 4 p.m. Those interested in attending must save their spot by registering by web form. Close to the bottom of the page that it will be at the bottom of the video link or the video description. And preseam.com/wispapalooza-2020 or 2022. Thanks again to all of our sponsors. Hope to see you guys at WISPapalooza, and here's the show. Hey everybody, this is Tommy with the Brothers WISP. We're doing a special episode this week. We're going to be talking about EU regulations and how they distribute money and some fun new things happening with that. With us today, we have a really new face. Over on my left is Niles.
Nigel.
I apologize.
Good.
I've been saying the same thing for the last 5 minutes and you haven't corrected me till now. Okay, so Nigel, what's your history with internet service providers?
I used to have to commute the equivalent of Washington up to New York. It was Dublin across to London, and realized that my clients didn't need to see me and I didn't need to see them. Could all be done over the internet, but couldn't get it. So I essentially stuck a mast on a hill somewhere to get fixed wireless going, and ended up through friends and family growth being the sysadmin for my own little fixed wireless network. So weird, a lawyer who ends up being sysadmin and lawyering at the same time. So I'm pulled into that stuff.
Okay, and then down to the left, or down below him, is Tom Smyth, and you were saying that you know Nigel.
Yeah, so I met Nigel years ago at an event where I was promoting MikroTik for fixed wireless and promoting, just I suppose, enhancing usage of or the working lives of ISPs by deploying MikroTik So this was back in 2007, I would say, Nigel, or 2008. And I met him, and he was asking how he kind of cross-examined me like a lawyer would in front of everyone. He was very good though, and I immediately was charmed by him, and I said, "Oh, this is a guy to keep an eye on." And then over the years, I suppose we've done pieces of projects together, and eventually we acquired his ISP, and it was a very a smooth transition, and we really appreciate the work that he and his team did. And during that process, we started just discussing various different state aid issues and how governments would apply it, just in the Irish situation, in the Irish context. And so that's how I kind of got to know Nigel, and that's how I got the kind of state aid bug, where as Nigel says, you got to read the legislation. Don't just read the pamphlets. Don't read just the brochures. Don't read the press releases that the governments give you. Look at what the rules they have to follow, and make sure that your rules are being applied in a way that's fair and reasonable and coherent. That whatever actions are being taken are coherent with that. And so that kind of embarked on a journey of engagement with various different authorities. And then, of course, the European Commission then decided to do a review of the guidelines, which they do periodically under what they call the REFIT program. And the wonderful thing about the EU is that they are incredibly transparent in their documentation. And in other words, so if they're trying to review a project or review guidelines, there'll be documents. So there's a document describing the guidelines. Then there'll be a document on how you should go about reviewing the guidelines and redefining it. And even the procedures for applying the guidelines, and then any kind of complaints procedures, it's all incredibly well documented. In fact, I think the Brexit hearers used to complain about the bureaucracy of the Commission, but to be fair, they do lay it out pretty clearly what they intend to do.
And what they intend to say and make everything
exactly
run.
and then
Okay.
and the process and why they're trying to do it as well, which is is important. So you have a political objective, and then you've got the legislative infrastructure around it, or as Nigel would call it, soft law infrastructure, and so around that. And so that's very important, and that's why I suppose we kind of got involved in it.
Okay, cool. And then below me we have Nick Buraglio.
Hey, how's it going? You said it right.
I actually have been practicing it for the last like 5 minutes.
Just saying it in the mirror, thinking about me. That doesn't weird me out at all, by the way. It's pretty hard to weird me out.
I pulled up the Modem podcast like about 10 seconds after you said that you were going to be on. I was like, how does this go? I got to pronounce this right. I've done it wrong so many times. Okay, so and then me, Tommy Krogan, out of Illinois. Just so we're going to be talking about in specific some EU regulations and how they've changed recently. And to kind of give a bit of contrast, a lot of our listeners, you guys are United States, but we have a lot of people all over the world. So to get everyone kind of on the same page, I've done a few different government funding for internet service. The company I worked for basically existed for a long time from government money. They're telephone co-op, so they know how to live off of government money to exist. Because to be honest, when you have 150 customers for telephone, that is not enough to pay people's paychecks and such. So I have a bit of experience. One of the last projects I did for that company was doing a broadband funding from the state of Colorado, actually. And in the United States, funding is kind of haphazard. You have federal programs, you have state level programs, you have local level programs. Sometimes a town or a city or a county will get funding from some other group to do some sort of project or meet some goal. And each of these projects, so like in the United States, FCC has had multiple different funding rounds for like RDOF, CAF funding. Traditionally, most of the time, it's always been technology agnostic. A lot of the time you were, oh, here we go. We have a new one. Hopefully, there we go. I didn't see, hopefully John is joining us.
Greetings.
Cool. All right. And so now below me as well, we have Monsignor John Osmon.
Greetings, salutations.
Ciao, come stai?
Yo no hablo español.
I don't think we could do it entirely in Spanish, but I could muddle through. But
Well, that was all I have.
okay.
I was speaking Italian, by the way.
Oh, okay. No. All right. So moving on, just giving the landscape of US broadband funding, which is pretty chaotic. States will have their own funding. So Colorado has their own 2 times a year program where they will give out funding for specific projects that they would do. And that's all taxpayer funded, and with the goal of getting as many Coloradoans connected to a level of internet connectivity. Colorado was 25.3. They didn't care how you got 25.3. They just needed proof that you would do it, and you to say for a long time they just needed you to say that you were going to do it, and that no one else in the area was already doing 25.3.
So I've found that there's like 4 levels
Mm-hmm.
of funding, right? So you have federal funding, which typically is a grant. It's a fixed amount of time, and it may pay for infrastructure, or it may be sort of open funding where you can do, you can pay salaries or whatever. And it may come from any number of different funding organizations. This is in the United States, right? It might be the NTIA, might be the FCC, it might be the NSF. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways you can do this based on what your business model is, or if you're an educational institution. Then you have state funding, and state funding may be similar to that. It may have more stipulations. It's definitely going to be more localized. Then you have municipal funding, which is what you were just talking about, where you have a municipality of some kind, county, city, whatever, right? And they're going to pay for very likely very localized improvements to existing infrastructure or to build new infrastructure. And then you have the fourth one is, like venture capital funding, which is whatever, it can be anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's one more corner case. One more corner case in there are the tribal lands right now. They're also getting something that are separate and different, but in places like New Mexico, it's an important piece of it.
Yeah, I was thinking that more of as municipal, right? Because it's extremely localized, but you're right. It is different in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different options and paths for government funding. Most of them will have, at least until a couple of years ago, most of them had the requirement that you did phone, because the United States was really, really focused on phone service for a very long time. Most of them were very much technology agnostic. Very few of them, if any, for a long time had really any validation of that, of the work being done. Very recently, there's been changes to like RDOF now, BDC funding, or not BDC funding, the new one that is very focused on fiber, has testing systems being put in. And so you're very much nowadays, the United States is getting better about checking on guys and following up on, hey, does this actually meet requirements? Let's see. So we have but that's all sorts of kinds of chaos. And like the Colorado one, I was talking to the guys and I was like, your version, like I've thought of 3 different ways to cheat your system as I was reading it. Like so there's lots of little holes in there, and the government does not go quickly on or change things quickly. So with that image and worldview, My understanding is that the EU does not have nearly as wide a range as funding options. Is that correct, Tom?
No, it is. So the EU originally came out with broadband guidelines. It was 2009. They revised it then in 2013 under the State Aid Modernisation Scheme, which just meant it was easier, more streamlined to give out aid where it was needed. So the idea is that state aid is, you've got a load of countries glued together, but they're different states and they have different governments that are independent. But in terms of the internal markets, the Commission have exclusive control over that. And so they set down the rules effectively that
Tom, I'm just going to step in and say that the word aid is a complete misnomer. It's a bandage for the spending of public money, which as we know, in the United States is not regulated at all. But the idea is that European governments and public authorities should not spend taxpayers' money in a way which drives private businesses out of business. So they shouldn't substitute or replace the existing market.
So they call that crowding out, I suppose, is what the term of the EU would call it. And it was set with various different guidelines. At first, it was like, oh, we just want to provide broadband. And there wasn't a measurement of how fast, if I recall correctly, just that it was faster than dial-up. That would be 09, I think, if I remember correctly, Nigel. And then in 2013, they kind of formulated a much more prescriptive set of guidelines, which was loosely basically saying you need a minimum of 30 megs down and 6 megabits up. And that would be considered what they called NGA, Next Generation Access. And what they wanted was that every household in Europe would have that by 2020. That was the target. And that half of the households would have access to at least 100 megs. So that was your kind of benchmark. And they were called ultra-fast networks or something like that. I'm pretty certain of that. And so those rules were there, and obviously they've been used for various different aid schemes. And there was various different validation schemes available. One thing that the Commission were concerned about, like what Tom Croghan touched on, as they call it, stakeholders acting maybe perhaps in bad faith, stakeholders being private operators. In other words, that they promised to deliver loads of bandwidth to loads of people to prevent the government intervening in the market. So they wanted to expressly prevent that. And so there was all sets of validation criteria, you know, like in other words, so you have to map the problem. So there's a whole set of guidelines and a process that the governments have to do in order to intervene in the market. And so the first thing is, one, establish that there's market failure. So our people, our citizens and businesses getting broadband. The second thing is measure the problem. So how many people are not getting sufficient broadband? And then based on that, you would then issue a tender. So you'd map the market, you issue a tender, you analyze the market, and then based on the market failure, you would then pay someone to build out infrastructure in the areas where they don't have. And they used to call them white NGA areas. So there's three categories: white, grey, and black. White was like there's zero operators operating in the area, and that you can go in and spend as much as you want to achieve the political objective of giving broadband to everyone. Then there was grey areas where it was like, well, there is a market, there's one operator there, and perhaps they're not being sufficiently competed against to drive down costs for consumers, and that there'll be a justification in some way, or that that there's something else that that they're on the edge. And then there's the black area, which would be where state aid is completely forbidden. And that would be a case where you have actually two operators with sufficient infrastructure in the area to cover the people in the area. And so that there'd be the putting public money in there would be a waste of money. So in principle,
how large of an area are you talking about?
It's however, so that would be up to the governments to decide. So the Commission, what's wonderful,
so it could be like the size of a neighborhood, or it could be the size of
a country or a province or a region. Okay. Yes, so it can be national, locally targeted. The Commission do encourage, but I would almost say it's optional. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nigel, but they would encourage people to size lots so that they're not too big, so that only one or two operators bid. They don't want that, but that if it's sufficiently small, that it would actually attract enough of the smaller local players so as not to cement, and they certainly don't want to try and cement the incumbents. So, for instance, in Ireland, the incumbent will be largely considered Air or one of the bigger providers, as opposed to, let's say, your challenger operators. So I presume in the US it'll be considered AT&T getting the money. The Commission don't really want that to happen, because as far as the Commission and the governments are concerned, they should have invested in the first place. But there was a significant amount of deregulation of and privatization of the telecoms market in the late 90s and early 90s. And that's probably precipitated some of the problem, because before there was a public service obligation. And so you had the cities effectively subsidizing the cities, the cities subsidizing the rural areas. So your 150 customers in a remote region of the country were effectively being subsidized by highly dense, highly profitable or super profitable areas of the country. And I suppose this is all in the backdrop that effectively, in principle, state aid is illegal in the European Union, that you can't intervene with public money in the private market. And so there's only exceptions, and the exception they call it is market failure. And so the new guidelines coming up now it's basically about defining what is market failure. And one of the things that we would be principally concerned ourselves is setting that threshold. So we have a target for 2030, which is gigabit to every home. And then there's the...
I'm going to stop you for a minute, just ask, what's the reciprocal developments going on in the States? So just, you're about to touch on where Europe is planning to go. Where's the States going at the moment? What's the development path you see for your side?
So I wanted to add a couple of quick caveats in here. First of all, I want to call out that you called the aughts the naughties, which I absolutely love, and I'm going to steal that because I've never heard it before. Second of all, it was mentioned earlier that you can't compete as with federal money, with government money. You can't compete with private businesses or whatever. In the States, there is, and I'm not sure if this exists outside of my home state, but when I worked for the R1 university that I worked for, and I ran a big part of the state network, one of the things that we had to do when we got our federal money is we had to spin off a company, because as a state funded institution, we are not allowed to compete with private businesses. So our pricing had to be, we had to become a different company essentially, because if we had things like, like a statewide optical network, and we had exchange, like we had built a couple of exchanges where we would allow basically any local entity to connect us for free, which gave the universities an advantage, all the advantages of an IX, right? But one of the core tenets of that was you can't compete with a local provider in any way. You have to be, if you're going to charge for anything, it has to be more expensive than the most expensive provider. So there are some nuances in some places. I'm not sure how that works at a federal level, but at least in the state that I live in, which is Illinois, that's how state entities have to be run.
So on the federal side, by and large, there was limitations on what is being provided. And so the limitation for a long time was 10 megabits per second download, 1 megabits per second upload, if that was being provided in what was called a census tract. So if any single consumer inside of that area was claimed to be provided or have the ability to be provided 10 megabits down, 1 megabits per second upload, basically that entire neighborhood size area was off limits for federal and most state funding. And so because that was the FCC definition of broadband. That has been changed to 25.3
right
now. And so that was a couple years back that changed. And so now if you're providing 25.3, you also had to be providing telephone service as well. So if you weren't providing telephone service and 10.1, you could be overbuilt with federal money. If you're doing 10.1 and not doing phone service, you could be overbuilt. So
this is residential too, right? This
residential and business.
And business. Oh,
yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. Anything. So a lot of guys would maybe wiggle room on that and do a business like point-to-point connection and be like, well, I can do it here, so I offer it, so therefore you can't build over me.
I sat with a meeting yesterday that was run by the FCC and talking about the new method of mapping. Instead of doing it at census tract level, they're doing it in individual points. They call it the fabric. But one of the pieces that they were talking about there is more towards, what's the appropriate place. They were kind of defining it as places where there is mass market broadband available. So, not some place where people have lots of fiber into there and they're selling all kinds of different circuits, but rather, what the multi buy.
Yeah. So, and that was like for the state level for Colorado, where I was doing my stuff. They didn't care about census tract. They cared about addresses and houses. So if you were that was where I squiggled through for a couple of my applications was, hey, CenturyLink, the local operator, says they cover this, X wireless company says they cover this, but they actually don't. They say they cover this in their filings, but they actually don't on their websites show that they do not actually provide coverage for here. That meets the government standards. And so you're able to wiggle room around in that. So it just depends on kind of where you're at. And so there's lots of variety, and it's actively changing right now because the newest rules are like 100 by 100. And that's where a boatload of the money is going, like billions of dollars. And then, which right now is equal to the euro. And so we're, there's a lot. So that's where a lot of this stuff is. And hey, just a quick little blip here. Some things were said that, we decided we didn't want in the cast. And so I edited those out. Should be good. Nothing terrible. Just want to be absolutely upfront with everyone so that the editing isn't really obnoxious. And we're also going to continue seeing stricter and stricter follow-up rules as to like prove to us that you are actually providing this, because that's been where that's where the government and the consumers have been failed a lot. We built it out.
Mechanisms that they use to do that. I haven't seen it in a while, but there used to be a system called Sam Knows, which was just a little hardware appliance that you would put on your at a residence or wherever off of a normal link, and it would do a bunch of different tests and report back, and it would report up to the federal funding agencies and the FCC or wherever. It went into the federal government apparatus somewhere.
And being honest, as a market operator, that stuff was valuable. Like the actual making sure the money is applied efficiently, and that the people who are taking the money are not getting it under false pretenses. Targeting is absolutely important. Nick, I just want to follow up on a couple of points you made, where you spun off a company. We have those things in Europe as well. It's basically like where it's an MEOP. So if you create a company that invests in the marketplace with state money as if it was actually a private investor, then that is actually okay, because it's not it's actually going. So the money, the company itself is actually standing on its own feet. So it's like a private market operator principle, I think, MEOP or something like that. Private economic market operator principle, I think. And so there's some of those issues. In terms of the state level actions versus federal or versus local county council, the member states or the aid granting authorities, as the EU would call it, give a wide range of options for people. So like you can do backhaul interventions. So if there's a failure in the provision of backhaul to multiple operators, they can do that. And in fact, that was done in the Czech Republic, and it's often cited as a good example. And I suppose the Irish wireless ISPs would probably lament that the Irish government chose not to support the market operators in Ireland with a similar measure, which was to address the problem of fibre failure of backhaul networks, give it to the people at the mast who could then actually improve the service locally. So there was that. That's just an example. But like it also, the NBP actually has panelists, so they do validate that they're delivering the required speed under the tender with the government, which is actually that is one good aspect of that measure. I'm not going to say much more on that one, but like in terms of the European Union, so now the thresholds, there's a threshold and a target. So the minimum threshold is basically saying if you reach this level, you're safe. In principle, it's illegal to overbuild you. And so that gives you kind of what we call legal certainty for operators and investors. So if you're an investor, you say, I'm going to invest and I know that no one's going to be getting state money to get a head start against me. And so what was being signaled for a long time was a minimum of about 100 megs. So if you couldn't reach 100 megs, in principle, there was market failure, and that's what was signaled to the market for a long time. It seems to be that there's now a lot more carve-outs, and that actually, no, you're only guaranteed if you reach a gigabit. So they've kind of merged the target of 2030 with the threshold for intervention once these new guidelines are adopted. And that creates a serious problem for crowding out, as we call it. It's where effectively I can't, as a private operator, go to a bank and say, look, give me this money, I can capture the market because I'm certain that I'll have first player advantage, and someone else is going to have to invest against me while it's much easier, obviously, for a state-aided company to invest because they're not driven by profit. It's not like, we need a certain amount of uptake. They just have to get the money for free. And that's a significant problem. So you can starve your finance line for existing operators today through that uncertainty created. And there's things like there's exceptions like if you have a survey. Now you can imagine if you have a survey. So if you have a survey that everyone says they want a certain speed, then that's the speed for market failure. Now, have you ever known anyone who doesn't have any consequence to select either 10 megs, 100 megs, 500 megs, or a gigabit, or 10 gigabit, or 100 gigabit? And you ask people on the doorsteps how fast do they want their broadband? Do you think they're going to go with a gig, 10 gig, 100 gig? If you keep pushing that level, it's not very scientific, I would say. It's probably the politest description I give of that particular measurement market failure. The other issue that we'd be concerned as an SME operator in Europe is that we're being effectively subjected to a future demand test. So even though we're building our networks out and dimensioning them correctly for the market demand, supply versus demand, instead of measuring that, what they're saying is, no, we have a gigabit target for 2030. You need to solve tomorrow's problem today without assistance. And if you can't prove you can do that, and you can't satisfy to all our requirements, we will overbuild you. Sorry, Nigel wants to interrupt.
Yeah, Nigel should be.
It's not to interrupt so much as just to layer in the measurement issue, which is we've heard that in the US, the FCC is now imposing a bit more rigorous testing and validation to make sure that things are being delivered, promises are being met. And the Commission has been ahead on that from 2013. But the internal tension inside Europe has been that the Commission has to assume that all member states and public authorities wanting to spend public funds are decent, honest, truthful, and always are complying with the rules. And it's the private market which has to be policed because they're the bad guys and will take all the shortcuts. And of course, the world doesn't work that way. And national governments and public authorities inside European countries that just love to get their hands on bigger tranches of money to spend it and grow their bureaucracies are just as prone to taking shortcuts as anyone else is. That's not something that's spoken about very much. The Commission won't come out and say it, but I'm sure they're aware of it. But that's the way the land lies. So in validating whether or not existing market players existing provision of services or their future plans meet the tests.
Hey, just a quick little blip here. Some things were said that we decided we didn't want in the cast, and so I edited those out. Should be good, nothing terrible. Just want to be absolutely upfront with everyone so that the editing isn't really obnoxious.
When, let's say, a national authority wants a big tranche of European money to roll out fiber, and there are a bunch of pesky little SMEs which say they're delivering, if you can apply the test in a harsh way, you end up with getting the result you want. So it's an interesting place to be at the moment. And we know, I think, Tom and I, that there's a federation of Italian WISPs that they're just meeting all sorts of problems from this perspective. Okay, that's just the validation issue is really interesting. And just perhaps one further bit that goes with it. How does one do the testing? Does one do the testing by reference to what an existing player is presently delivering? And how do you measure it? Do you put a box, a router or something, test box, and have it talk back to an FCC server? Are you concerned about the concurrency ratio that is being adopted? So the minimum, let's say it's 23 down. Is that 23 being delivered to each individual customer on the basis of a concurrent supply? Or are you allowing a ratio, so let's say, we'll have pools of 10 customers who can draw on 23 megs at any one time. Where do you set that ratio? 10, 12, 15%? There's all sorts of little clever bits which can be tweaked. And unless the rules are laid out really clearly for everyone to see, no one knows whether they're going to cut the mustard or not. So,
I mean, to be fair, that's the measurement piece.
Coming up with the new European rule is to get away from accepting or having to deal with real world data and just imposing a hypothetical. So here's our hypothetical model. And if, whether you're existing or you're planning to invest, you don't meet, what you're doing doesn't meet our hypothetical, we cut you out. So you can be a network in the process of upgrading your system and have a mix of customers drawing or contracting at different levels. And as you upgrade your kit to the higher and higher speeds, you bring the customers over onto it if they want to pay. But if the entire network and every customer connected doesn't meet the benchmark for the highest possible level, the whole network gets struck out. So there's some really complicated bureaucratic stuff to be dealing with.
So really quick, could you give an example of how these tests, this testing in like individual countries is being done? So
the proposed one in the new guidelines basically says a 5-to-1 concurrency ratio. So, and they're saying that the test for any bottleneck on your network has to be at peak hour, and that if you don't provide that information at peak hour, your entire data set can be withdrawn or invalidated. And so they're being quite prescriptive. And the problem that we would see it as a market operator is they're trying to say, realistically, if we were to summarize the issue, what they're saying is there's not enough fiber or equivalent infrastructure out in the countries. And what they're saying is in order to achieve that, what we would need is we need to do a market failure test. And what they're asking operators to do is not behave like market operators and invest in 100% coverage at 100% capacity for a 2030 guideline today. And if you don't, you fail. And so the problem with that is that, even the largest operators have said, if you apply this test, we will fail. So an SME operator being applied with this test is absolutely almost certainly doomed to fail. I've seen situations where that has occurred, where, on paper, someone looking at it reasonably would say, well, yeah, that passes. And you have a consultant hired by an aid granting authority, basically do their absolute damnedest to anyway, I'm moving on. Sorry.
Yeah, make you look bad. So really, before we go to you, Nigel, you say the word SME. What do you mean by that? So
SME is a small medium enterprise. I think it's under to 10 million turnover, or maybe it's 50 million turnover. It's quite small. So anyone who's in that range But we would be more worried about that. And obviously the Commission have certain obligations to SMEs on the principle of what they call proportionality. Okay. In other words, that they can't, and what we were seeing is in some of the prescriptive guidelines, which are really, by the way, the prescriptive guidelines in principle, like the fact that they're looking at this detail, and the devil is in the detail in this stuff, is really important. The issue is that the way they're assessing it and the thresholds they're setting is that it's extremely difficult for an operator that is performant, that is not failing its market or failing its customers in terms of demand, would actually fail. What we would advocate for, what we've been requesting in our submission, myself, Nigels, and Asso Providers, Asso Provider, an Italian ISP providing association for about 250 ISPs. They've been extremely proactive in this space. But what we've been advocating for is, look, simple. You know, it's like the Cisco Quas rule. If your demand exceeds 80% of your capacity, you're going to run into problems. So the reality is that once your traffic levels are on a given link or a bottleneck reach 80% of demand, then you have an obligation, or a good operator should invest and upgrade its network, either horizontally, as in just, double up links, LACP and all that, or vertically, going from 10 gig, 1 gig to 10 gig to 100 gig.
There's lots of different ways in that can be a consideration, and that's actually really cool that the EU has like a recognition of oversubscription, because that's been an issue that a lot of people in the United States have run into when they've been working through, is like when we're being requested for our testing is like, well, how much oversubscription am I allowed to do? Am I allowed to like stagger the testing so that I'm not doing all of my tests right at 6:00 p.m. all at the same time, because then it's going to look really, really bad. Can I do 6 and 6 at 1? And the FCC usually just allows for some level of that. But Nigel, you were raising your finger, and you've made some really good points so far. So I would love to hear what your thoughts are at this moment.
Tom will have to verify this, but if you analogize the European Commission to the FCC or to the federal government, there seems to be a tension, a conflict between two different divisions, one of which is very motivated to try and get the European citizens wired up to fiber or equivalent as fast as possible from the point of view of an intelligent and wide economy. And another division which is required to police the application of public funding in a way that stops them overbuilding private networks. And it's thinking of the scales of justice, it's kind of difficult to see at the moment which way or which of those divisions is going to win. There's an intense pressure to get the continent wired up, and even if that means the rules are softened off to allow public funds to be used to overbuild networks that are considered to be lagging or insufficiently good, well, maybe that's the price of progress. So that's a place we seem to be or might be in right now.
I think there's two important facts here that I wanted to point out. The first one is overbuild is really only relevant under the subject of time, right? Because eventually utilization will meet the resources that are available. It's just a function of, is it overbuilt now? Maybe. Is it overbuilt 10 years from now? Very unlikely. So I think there's a nuance there a little bit.
Real quick question, Nick, when you're saying overbuilt, do you mean like I put like a 5,000 horsepower engine in my Impala, and so like I have overbuilt the engine for what I am building? Or are you talking about I have an area of coverage and somebody is overbuilding that area of coverage?
Not talking about that. Is that what you're referencing? I think that's different, right?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, those are two different definitions, two different uses of the word. So
I agree. So
let's really quick qualify. Nigel, where were you saying overbuilding? And Tom, where were you saying overbuilding? So
overbuilding is like a state-aided operator overbuilding a private operator. In other words, wasting public money.
area of coverage?
As far as
Area of coverage. Okay, Nigel, is that where you were as well?
It's not over provisioning at all.
No, that's my meaning as well.
That was your meaning as well, Nigel? Okay, cool. So,
No.
so then Nick, you were talking as putting a huge engine into an Impala.
Right.
Yeah.
Although one could potentially argue that the same caveat applies, because as internet access, legally speaking, I'm not a solicitor, right? I'm an unfrozen caveman lawyer, right? So like one could potentially argue that overbuilding, as in layering on top of another existing provider, will eventually also succumb to this is now normal, because I know many people that have multiple ISPs at their homes because the internet is now basically a utility, right? It's electricity, water, whatever. So I'm kind of in the weeds a little bit on that one, but I think the real point that I wanted to make was that the measurement pieces are very hard because it's so nuanced and it's so dependent on definitions that are kind of squishy. And I haven't seen the European stuff. Maybe they have better. I mean, in Europe, they tend to define things a lot more clearly. There's a lot more rigor around stuff. So I think that may be different than it is here in the States. But, measurement is very difficult here because it's subjective to however the person is chosen to interpret it. So they could say, well, 25/3, if I test at any given time, and I can get that, then I comply, right? But if I test everything at once, I probably don't, because that's against the core tenet of a service provider, which is to oversell, right? You always are, no matter what you think you're doing, you're overselling because that's how you make profit. So I think that's really kind of a gray area. And maybe
they're in on this. You're right, and they have really stepped up to trying to stop that happening. Because they're conscious that there's been an awful lot of over-promising and under-delivery, and so the new regime in draft that Tom and I have seen is far more rigorous in pinning that down.
And the rigor is actually welcome. Like it was just that the thresholds they were setting were what I would call, they were over provisioning for customers and driving what you would consider a profitable business into a loss situation and making it near impossible for a normal performant market operator. And what I mean by that is where a person can reasonably expect to get good performance even in the busy hour. We see it ourselves, like, as a base station fills up, the customers start to squeak. We deploy a new base station in parallel, and that's what happens, but it's like a demand-based capacity expansion model that we use.
Quick question. Yeah. Nigel, what is the EU allowing for oversubscription?
Oh, it's gone the other way. What they're saying, I think Tom mentioned it, is you must not exceed applying. Did we say 5%? Is it 5 to 1 concurrency ratio?
There was a 5 to 1 concurrency ratio, or a model that would be accepted by the member state, or and submitted to the Commission for approval. The issue is that has been a benchmark.
What is 5 to 1 concurrency?
Here we go. So let me explain it. Let me explain this. If one is required to supply, let's say 23 megabits to each customer, the requirement is that you cannot put more than 5 customers onto each 23 megabits of bandwidth you have.
Okay.
Because
it might be easier in the 100 meg range, as in if you don't. So if 100 megs available, only 5 customers.
Let's pick the benchmark as 100. You can't share that 100 megabits with any more than 5 customers. Now, wait a minute. Let's just back up and think about this. When we're talking about customers, or users, as in the number of persons in a property that that's connected to the network, are we talking about the number of devices, or are we talking about the bandwidth supplied to the particular premises, and then you don't even pay any attention to the individual users or devices inside it? So there's complications there for a start. The headline bit should be to the point of delivery in the premises. So let's just remove all the complications about devices and users inside the premises. So the requirement is that you must not share, you must not add into a pool to use that 100 megabits any more than 5 people.
Did they have any backup? Did they have a reason? I mean, do they have any data that says that's why they're using this? You know, in a wireless network, I'm used to the idea that once you get about 1,000 people, if you have 4 meg per end site, you take care of most of those people quite well, as long as you have a large enough pipe to get to them. Those concurrency numbers are insane compared to what I've seen.
I mean, for small ISPs,
the problem is this: that it has been taken as a sort of almost biblical rule that bandwidth demand from users is going to keep increasing at the exponential rate that it has been for the last XT years. Now, I'm going to pause there and say, I don't know about you guys, but I think there's data now to show through COVID and now coming out of COVID, has bandwidth demand begun to level off or peak, or is it still increasing? Generally,
it's not exponential. It's slightly, it's linear, but far more flatter than vertical linear.
The assumption has been that it would keep increasing at the rate that it has done before, and therefore the concurrency ratio, the size of the pool of customers you could put to any particular amount of bandwidth would have to get tighter and tighter and tighter, closer and closer and closer to effectively dedicated per customer. And what the Commission has found is that if that is the assumption, then a private network, or indeed a public one that is passed as meeting the rules now, is inevitably going to fail those rules in a certain period of time looking forward. So yeah, we've let them through on a 10-to-1 ratio, but we know perfectly well on the basis of this assumption that in X many years, we're going to need a 5-to-1 ratio and they'll fail it. So what do? Do you keep putting people through the ringer every couple of years and saying you still passed or you failed? Or is it once you get through the barrier or the test once, it doesn't matter how useless you are afterwards, you've got through, so no public funds can be brought against you. So to meet that problem and using this assumption that bandwidth is just going to keep going on that same level or increase at that same rate, the Commission appears to have said, okay, let's pick a concurrency ratio that we think will be good enough for 2030. And we're going to winch that concurrency ratio and apply it now as a test, which is the point Tom's trying to make. It's applying a requirement, a predicted requirement, the basis of which we now begin to see is perhaps flawed, and applying it to existing networks now.
But even as John Osmon pointed out there, what we're seeing, and with the Netflix data and even data from other users, and if you look at ISP data, it is roughly the actual usage at peak time per user, multiplexed all together, is of the order of 4 megabits in fiber areas. So the market, unrestricted in fiber areas, 4 megabits demand. And so if you're delivering 150, 200 megabits to an area nominally, and like I've done speed tests in my home, my parents are getting 120 down, 30 up on a fixed wireless connection at 10 o'clock at night. That's pretty damn close to peak time. So how come that can be considered a failure when they're not actually comparing supply versus demand? They're providing a kind of a future model to push. And really, as one Commission official kind of said, it's sending a big build signal to the bigger ISPs to say, build out or you'll be overbuilt. The problem is, for small, they haven't really taken account of the small ISP who's building ahead of the market in line with the demand, and basically applying a demand-based investment approach where you go, oh, the assets have delivered, they've reached their capacity, I need to deploy further assets to keep my current customer base happy and leave room for expansion, like a normal market operator would. There's another issue that we have, is that one of the other guidelines that you can see, and it's I suppose in ways it feels like it's the government's pushing back on the industry, but it's deeply, again, it's another test where they say you must take account as a fixed wireless operator. You have to take account as your premises passed, your premises connected. So the old guidelines, it was your premises connected determine your performance. If you have, let's say, coverage for 1 million users, but you only have 10 customers connected, if you would provide capacity for those 10 customers, you're provided in the market and you can deploy for further people. The issue is that now what the new guidelines say is you must take account of the premises connected plus passed. And if you don't, you'll be disregarded. And the issue with that test is, in order to actually get my investment protected against an overbuild, I have to deliver 100% capacity for 100% market penetration for 100% of my premises passed day one, in order to have my infrastructure recognized, which is clearly unfair. Not only that, but it also drives an inefficient investment model.
It's not just unfair, it's actually a collision of a public funded model where the contractor is paid to go out and provide capacity or the availability of connection to all premises in an area, in other words, 100%, as against the private market model, which is, I'm going to have enough capacity to provide those who want it now, and I'll build more and invest more when the demand comes at me for it.
Exactly. Not only that, but if I'm made to invest in an area to cover 100%, even though I might only get 20% or 30% uptake, I have to deliver 100% capacity and not invest it in other areas to expand the coverage area. And we all know, as wireless operators, or any operator here, the hardest megabit you get in is the first megabit to a place. Your point of premise, establishing a point of premises, is the hard part. Adding antennas, adding infrastructure, that's kind of, it's cents in the dollar when you think about it. And already you have a revenue stream established as well. So, it's one of those ones that it's a test that's been applied to the market to determine a market failure in which the market wouldn't do in the first place, or shouldn't do, or shouldn't be.
I think there's one exception to that, though. So I agree that establishing your customer base is that's the hardest part, right? But there is also a very close second in many rural areas, which is getting your transit. A lot of places just don't have options for transit. Even getting transport to somewhere is not cost effective.
That's where I was about to run. I was about to ask about open access rules. I mean, there are some rules here that are saying, do we use the same terms, middle mile, last mile on on those pieces? Are there any rules talking about, open access to the middle mile fiber so that multiple people can use it, or even for the last mile? I mean, I'm kind of the opinion that if you're using the public right of way, you should be excluded from being a layer 3 ISP. Yeah, I just believe that would make the market a lot better for everybody. So, and it would also put a multitude of ISPs out there, just like we used to have in the dial-up days.
Yeah, I mean, so two things, right? So the elephant in the room is the middle mile. Like, it just does in the States, it just doesn't exist in many places. And where it does exist, it's so eye-wateringly expensive that people just can't use it, right? You just cannot get, I want a gig service and I'm in, Bumble Stump, Oklahoma, or wherever, right? Oh, that'll be $10,000 a month. Great. Do I get any IP addresses? No, that's another $3,000 a month for like a /29. It's just, it's very difficult to get connectivity in those rural places. And I had another point and I forgot it.
Okay,
so
just
really quick,
though.
Actually, I'm curious, what does transit and transport look like in Europe compared to the United States?
I could talk about Ireland specifically. So we're paying about 7 cents a meg in the data center for bandwidth, and that probably falls to less than that, but that price is about a year old.
Tom, I think the question is more broadly directed to, is there anything requiring open access? And the answer is yes.
Yeah. So there is
go ahead.
So there is an open access requirement, and the open access requirement is that if the public, I suppose the issue is you get this body, it can be either the public body or a gap-funded private entity. So they've filled the funding gap for the capital for the investment. And so let's say if it's 50%, so they'll say, we know that if you get 50% of the funding, it'll become economically viable for you as a private operator to operate that network. That's one way. But the private operator gets to own it. Or you can have a utility company established in the common interest, and it actually is a public authority that we all pay and we all get equal access to. So there is that benefit with the state aided scheme that I can't deny. The issue, I suppose, is that if you are a private operator offering reasonable funding costs for bandwidth in an area, you should be protected from overbuild. And that has been a decision that the Commission have actually issued funding on before, where even though there was sufficient speed in the area, the one operator, so it went from grey to white based on the pricing the operator was imposing on the users.
Okay.
That was the Welsh scheme, I think.
Are we not looking at also the fact that operators with significant market power are required to give neutral open access at regulated prices?
So there's another elephant in the room which we haven't mentioned, which is the whole regulatory minefield. So it's all the former, if you can imagine in Europe, all the former incumbents that were state-owned, that were spun out, are regulated by a regulator because they were a monopoly. And they do have to give access to the other ISPs to their products and services. I will say in Europe, not all regulators were created equal, and not all regulations work.
I have a quick factoid about the open access networks, and I'm curious to know if this is anyone else's experience. So when back in a previous employer, we got some shovel-ready money, and we built a fiber to the home to underserved area in where I live now. And one of the core tenets of that was that it was an open access network. Now, this is 11 years ago, right? So I think it was pretty early for that. And we solicited every local provider, which there are a handful other than, there's the big ones, the big cable company, the big phone company. And there's a handful of other pretty good size internet providers here as well. We said, this is completely open to you. We will give you total access to provide whatever services you want over this fiber network. At the time it was a Adtran based Active E, but it was capable of doing multiple services, and it was very robust. And by the way, the only requirement we have is that you also connect to the exchange point, which you should do anyway, right? It's all free. It's zero cost. We had exactly 0 providers interested in this. No one even wanted to do it. And the big ones were like, why would we ever do that? We would just build our own. And then they never did. So I'm curious to know if you've had any luck with the open access networks, because I love the idea of them, but granted, I have a sample size of 1, right? But no interest whatsoever. No one wanted to use it.
I think if the prices are set sufficiently that people can make money, people will interconnect. If the conditions of interconnecting with them are not too onerous, and is important, and also that the people who are giving them the money control them. What's meant to be happening is they're getting concessions, they're getting state aid. So in order to actually get the state aid, you have to give other people access. And so they have quite significant requirements in the guidelines for access, and that's pretty good. Even on the mobile issues, they're basically saying you have to give MVNO access. You have to give for data services, all that. And that's all very positive, actually, even though I think a lot of mobile providers might be upset about it. So when the state aid question comes in and there's a gap in the market, giving open access to multiple competitors is good. And that's a mechanism that the Commission use to minimize distortion of competition. I'm not saying it, or certainly reduce it. I'm not going to say minimize, reduce it. The primary mechanism that they use for minimizing distortion of competition is establishing where areas of operation that there are currently people investing or credibly going to invest, and not to build there because it's a waste of public money, primarily. And then the second one is that you give open access. So they're a wholesale only operator. Although they have fudged that, in the Irish case, we have this thing, and it was actually cited in the guidelines as a precedent. I don't welcome it that much, but it's where the wholesale operator can be a retailer of last resort. So it's like if no other operator offers the service, then they can offer it. And it's a bit of a concern. And I think my concern would be if they were to set prices in such a way that no other operator could make money on it, then they would be able to retail as last resort potentially. And maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but sometimes the communications market can make you a cynical person. But and so not all open access networks were created equally. We have had a number of iterations of them in Ireland, some better than others. But yes, if you're going to do an intervention in the market, it should be wholesale led only, and they shouldn't be allowed to compete against retail operators. Absolutely.
So I think what you're saying here is, just like with everything in IT, the answer is it depends.
It depends. At a meeting that I asked the question, I was hoping for a reassuring answer. And the answer I got was, it depends. And it frightened the living, I'm going to say something out of me. And it is frightening because that it depends, there's no legal certainty there.
Right.
And as a market operator,
there are certainties in our industry, right? Cheap, fast, reliable, pick two. If it's not MTU, it's DNS, and it depends. Those are the absolute bedrock certainties of our chosen professions and areas of expertise. And I will die on that hill.
So the call to action, if anyone from Europe who would be affected by this for the next 10 years, is to give me a call, email me tom.smyth, spelled with a Y, at wirelessconnect.eu. Talk to your local MEPs. They are important players in this. Talk to your local ministers. Talk to your local governments and outline these concerns as people with an SME, and have a look at the guidelines. The guidelines, to be honest, there's some really good stuff in it, and I welcome a lot. There's a lot of really good ideas in it, and we want them implemented. But the thresholds should measure the market. If you're going to measure the problem, measure correctly and certainly apply the right scale. That's the key.
Tom, just filling in on that, it's worthwhile, or maybe worthwhile, having a peek from the US at the draft guidelines, because you can see some of the rigor which they have applied to the testing and concurrency ratios and so forth. And it's good stuff. It's really well thought through. You may not agree with it, but it really gets you thinking about how this can be done properly.
Absolutely. And it's just that threshold. If thresholds can be set correctly, I think it could be a really positive thing for the industry and for the consumer. And so what we will do is we'll put the links in the comments section below.
Yeah, I will definitely do that. So as we're kind of wrapping out, and Nick, you've been saying for a couple minutes that you need to get rolling. So before you sign off, if somebody out on the internet wanted to get a hold of you, what's the best way to get a hold of you, Nick?
I'm on various Slacks. I'm on Brothers WISP Slack and a handful of others. Got a Twitter at Forwarding Plane that I look at sometimes. Or, I'm always available on you can find me on the Podcast Modem Show, where we do deep dive stuff. I'm not that hard to find. Just Google for me, LinkedIn, wherever.
He is pretty easy to find, unlike some of us. So really quick, Nigel, what would you say then would be your closing words, and where you would where you would want people to kind of look at and talk, continue communicating to you about this, or learning more information?
Gosh, I don't know. I can, that throws me for six. Anyone who wants to react to what Tom has said, if you want any questions, come to me, push them at him, and I'm happy then to come back direct.
Okay, so and I spent a few hours kind of looking at some of this stuff. Actually, I do actually have a quick question. There's a lot of quality of service information that is brought up and mentioned. What does that measurement look like? Because QoS is kind of this weird big thing that everyone likes to refer to, but nobody really knows what it is and what you're actually, and the goal that different people have is going to be extremely different. So what is that what does that mean in the EU measurements?
So 0.1% packet loss maximum, latency latency being maximum, I think 30 milliseconds, and 1 millisecond per 100 kilometers of fiber thereafter. So, if you're, on a long haul, if I remember correctly, it's ITUY 1540, I think. It's basically they're using the BEREC. BEREC is the body of European regulators, okay? And they're using the definition of ultra fast, and they've kind of transposed that, or they propose to transpose that, but there's some confusion on that. But effectively, you're talking about of the order of, the target is a gigabit, 30 milliseconds. There's certainly restrictions on jitter, restrictions on packet loss, as there should be. No one would dispute that. And they're being careful enough to actually consider, I suppose, in Ireland, it's quite small, but it's an additional millisecond for every 100 kilometers, so they're being kind of careful on that, if I remember correctly.
Millisecond per 100 kilometers back to where?
So if you were to, I'm going to get, they actually don't define that, but the understanding I would have is if you're of a capital city and that's where your core POP is, that you need to get from internet, you need to go for if your customers are 200 miles away, then you get another 2 milliseconds, so it can be 32 milliseconds. That kind of way. It's that kind of, but which is reasonable. I mean, no one wants the 500 millisecond satellite links. No one disputes that. But again, it's in the Annex 1 of the proposed guidelines. So they'll probably be going for adoption soon. But if you are worried, if you're a supplier of broadband to SMEs, certainly you should give me a shout, because I do think it'll affect your customer base quite significantly, particularly if you're in the wireless market. I think it could be used as a stick to wipe us all out, So certainly if you are provided to a lot of European ISPs as an equipment provider, reach out to me, particularly if you have a European point of presence, like a European office or headquarters. That obviously would help in terms of raising that issue with your local national government, and also inform the Commission of your concerns. To be fair, the Commission have been very reasonable. They have listened, but there's a competing thing. There's a political objective of gigabit to everyone, and then there's actually protected SMEs who are meeting the market demand. And and
the market demand right now is not gigabit symmetrical to the home constantly. So okay, cool. So everyone's kind of starting to sign off, so we'll kind of probably try to wrap it out here. Tom, if somebody out on the internet was wanting to get a hold of you, you said Tom.Smyth
at wirelessconnect.eu, and it's Smyth with a Y, or Augment Connect 1, Twitter at Augment Connect 1, and you can get me, and you can get me on the Brothers WISP. The guys will email me if I'm not on, because sometimes I disappear for a while. But I do try to get back to anyone who does contact me, and certainly, and I really appreciate Tom. I'd like to just say thanks for talking about this issue, because while the relevance is not hugely there for the US, but what's interesting is to see the techniques that aid granting authorities use to squeeze ISPs. I think it's interesting because it could be used against legitimately performing players, in the stateside,
Well, and very much so. Like, similar rules and tactics have been used in the States and can be used throughout the world. And this is stuff that people really should be aware of. And as much as we want to be like these cowboys who don't care about what everyone else is doing, we do need to be paying attention, because unfortunately the outside world is going to come in and bite you. So Tom, are you going to be at WISPapalooza?
When is that on?
That's in a week and a half. So it's October.
We've recently taken over another ISP, so I would love to. But I've been at EuroBSD Con last week. I was in Brussels, the week before last. I was in Brussels last week. I think my colleagues and business partners who would be too happy with me leaving for another week, which I would love to do, because I haven't been in Vegas in about 5-6 years. So yeah, I'm starting to suffer withdrawal symptoms. Next year, I will do next year.
Next year, all right, cool. So you'll do, and we'll see where WISP America is as well. So I will be at WISPapalooza. I'm also going to be going to Chinog. Got my tickets signed up for that. John, you were saying that you were going to be there, and that's the reason I'm going. You're muted.
I'm not supposed to be muted. Yes. Yes, I'll be at Chinog. I will not be going to WISPapalooza. Real quick, people trying to find me, John@osmon.net, on the Brothers WISP Slack, and I must run now. So good luck, and thank you for having this. If we're not paying attention to the regulations that are going towards us and to others, the regulators will find us before we notice it. So keep track of them.
Yeah. Thanks very much, John. Appreciate you coming on.
Take care.
Yeah. All right. Y'all take care. Everybody have a wonderful day. Tommy at lostcreek.tech on the Slack all the time. And plenty of different ways you guys can listen to other podcasts. So I'm gonna let
Brothers WISP, let's take a ride through space on this mothership. Wireless networking. We talk about equipment and methodology, so sit back and start learning. Lighten up the tower so people can start searching. Shooting up the web in neighborhoods, net surfing. We got horrible jokes, we're loud and annoying, but we're informative facts, we're not disappointing. Just give us a listen, cause fun is the mission. I'm telling you, you don't know what you are missing. Ideas and some good comedy given. If you missed the show already, don't worry, you're forgiven.